Hello, my name is Tathagata Ray, and I'm the manager of the SCI Innovation Programs here at Praxis. Today, we are going to be talking about health technology development and adoption. So there are multiple layers of how you develop a technology and then eventually take it to the market for its eventual adoption. And then we are going to be following that process through and giving you some details around how to go about that process. Now, in terms of the spinal cord injury innovation ecosystem, one of the most common questions is, okay, I have an idea. What are the next process or steps that I need to take in order to commercialize my innovation? Well, the short answer is it depends, because no two technologies are the same, and there are therapeutics, there are medical devices, and each has its own way of how to bring that product eventually to the market. In the next slide, we will be talking about how the health technology innovation process kind of looks like for people who might not have developed a health technology product earlier. It looks like a simple process where you come up with a rough sketch of the idea, then you create a prototype through some initial financing, and then bench test your prototype, get some additional funding to go for animal testing, and then after that go for first in human testing, and then finally fundraise more to actually go into clinical trials, and once you get the regulatory approvals, launch your product. This is a good overview of how the process or the development looks like, but there are so many nuances under each of these subheadings. The actual technology innovation process is much more complicated, as you can see in this figure. In reality, there are multiple layers of each of these subgroups that I talked to you about, and under each of these subgroups, they are intricately linked with the process that is there. So it's not a waterfall process, but it's an iterative process. You have the external influencers, you have the clinical stakeholders, you have the regulatory and reimbursement stakeholders, as well as the operations that all ties all of these together. From conception to full adoption is a long process, and it can take anywhere from 5 to 10 years based on the complexity of the product. And even for a simple 510K product, to bring it from concept stage all the way to the market, it can take anywhere up to like $30 million. So it's not an easy or a short process. In order to make sure that your product is eventually adopted in the market, you need an effective reimbursement strategy. What it means is that there are 3 critical components of it: coverage, coding, and reimbursement. And each of these are equally important in order to make sure that your product is reimbursed by somebody, whether it is a payer, but whether it is an insurance company or the government stakeholders or the end users themselves maybe, you need some way of getting reimbursed for your product. You need to establish a product market fit early. And that is why it is so critical for you to engage with the stakeholders. In case of spinal cord injury research, you need to engage people living with spinal cord injury to get their feedback, get their opinions on what they want to see in a product, whether the product or the technology that you're thinking of developing meets their needs or not. And then also you need to talk to physicians and health professionals, because you can have a product that works great and is really meeting the needs of your end users. But if it doesn't fit into the workflow of the clinicians or the physicians, they're not going to adopt it. So you need to ensure that you take their feedback into account. And then in the end, you need a clear business model and a product roadmap, because without that, you cannot launch a successful business. Moving on, as I said, there's no template for developing a product from the bench to taking it to large-scale adoption nationwide. But there are certain pillars of commercialization, you might say, that exist for taking this product from bench to the mass market adoption. Not all of these specifics will apply for every technology, but this kind of gives an overview of how to break down that complicated process that I showed you earlier into sizable chunks. First, you need to do the validation of your technology. You have an idea, you have an innovation, you need to figure out how to assess that opportunity. What are the patient indications that will address, that your technology will address? You need to do a market assessment and a technology assessment to see the feasibility of it. And then at the very beginning, you need to figure out what your IP strategy is going to look like. Is it going to be a buyout? Is it going to be a licensed technology? That will all figure in your business plan. Once you have that initial assessment done, you need to go towards developing the product, the actual product. You need to maybe initially create a proof of concept product. You need to, at the same time, make sure that the product that you're developing is designed for manufacture. Because you can develop a product, but if it's not being able to be scaled up, then you will not be able to have a successful business. You need to make sure the technology that you are developing can be reimbursed properly. It can be, it can go through the regulatory process and all of those things. Once you have developed this product, then you need to make sure that you are building a bridge from your product to your end users. You need to do things like build the infrastructure of how the product is going to be used by providers and used by the end users. You need to operationalize the technology. Is it easy to use? Is it easy to maintain? What are the vendors that you need support from? Once you have built that out, then you need to go for driving the utilization. The first thing about adoption of any new technology is that you need to spur a behavior change in your providers as well as insurance companies as well as end users, because there is already a standard of care potentially for the technology or the indication that you are developing for. How do you make sure that your technology or innovation will be adopted over the current standard of care? And that is very critical in order to ensure that your product becomes a success in the market. And then once you have established that foundation, then you need to look at how can I make this as the current standard of care by supplanting whatever the current standard of care is there. And that is where you need to make sure that you come up with clinical care guidelines, create proper data through your clinical research, and then make sure that it is being adopted by the clinician community as well as the insurance community. Now, one of the key things to do in this whole process is what we call the integrated knowledge translation. It is a key to accelerated innovation adoption. What it means is that you need to engage the various stakeholders as early as possible in your process, in your development stage. Engage early, engage often. Because in many cases, what we have seen is that engaging them once or twice might not be sufficient, because as I mentioned, this whole process is an iterative process, not a waterfall process. So as you iterate on your product development, as you iterate on your even things like user manuals, you need to engage with your end users to make sure it is still meeting their needs. As we all know, it all starts with a basic research question. Once you come up with that research question, you need to collaborate to develop and refine that question to make sure that it matters to the people with spinal cord injuries for whom you are developing this product. Because you might have a hypothesis of how it might help them, but you don't really know for sure until you have talked to them. So as long as you are able to engage them early in the process, it would help you create or develop a product that actually would meet the unique needs of this population. It's very easy to think that the product that you have developed might be the best in the world, and probably is, but the best product in the world, if it doesn't meet the needs of your end user, is not going to be a success in the market. In all through this process, whether it is a funding application, when you're developing the methods, or even when you're conducting the research, make sure to partner and design your study by taking inputs from people living with spinal cord injury, because they are the ones for whom you are developing this product. And then once you have performed your research and have received the data, make sure that people with spinal cord injury are included in the analysis and interpretation of the findings. Because you can develop a model of or create your own interpretation of the findings, but it is the people living with spinal cord injury who would be the experts in actually interpreting that findings to make sure that it is meeting their needs. And then again, at the end of the publishing of the data, make sure that you're working with the SCI networks that Praxis can help you with to ensure that your findings reach the end users and lead to real world impact. So that is the cycle of the integrated knowledge translation that we can help engage for you. Now, as I mentioned, the health tech commercialization process is a long path from the bench to nationwide. Here at Praxis, we support various technologies and startups throughout the continuum of this development process. We have our Praxis Ideation Clinic and the various EIS programs that we run, where we engage with innovators and researchers while they're doing bench research to help them come up with a proof of concept of their device. Once they have gone through that initial proof of concept stage, then they move on to the discovery research, after which they can participate in our SCI Incubate programs, where we support early prototype of their devices to ensure that they are validated and they can achieve a product market fit for their product. Now, as you look at this diagram or this graphic, you can see there are a couple of places where a potential valley of death exists. What happens is that as you do your discovery research or your clinical research, you know what to do during discovery research or clinical research. The valley of deaths are the areas where, without additional funding, potential ideas might not come to fruition. So what we do at Praxis is ensure that you are able to navigate this valley of death by validating your approach, by utilizing a network of clinicians, researchers, and Plex consumers, so that you achieve product market fit early in the process. And then we also help with developing and iterating your design to ensure your prototype actually needs of the end users that you're developing for. Now, this process, again, I want to reiterate again, is not a waterfall process. It is an iterative process that goes back and forth. You might have a prototype, you go for clinical research, you realize that it is not providing you the right endpoints that you need to show that it is valuable for the end users that you're developing for. So you need to go back and create another prototype maybe. So that is why you have this back and forth arrows in this figure to ensure that you are aware that it's an iterative process from the bench to nationwide. Now, looking at the overall process, I want to make sure that you know some of the best practices to follow to ensure that you are able to go from the bench to nationwide adoption in a timely manner or an ordered manner. During the discovery phase, things that you might be looking for is that who is the end users who are going to use this device? Who are going to pay for this device? Is it something that will be reimbursed by a government insurer or a private insurer? Is it going to be used in a clinic setting or a hospital setting? Because the payers for those kind of environments would be different. Who is the stakeholders who are going to approve and use this device? And how would people learn about this technology, about this new technology? Is it something that you need to engage directly clinicians? Is it going to be a rehab center? You need to identify that prior to going into the actual clinical research. And then again, what is the current standard of care? And how do people change, or how do people change that process? There might be some publications that clinical care guidelines that professional societies might be coming up with. Which professional society is it that you need to approach? Those are the things that you need to identify as part of your discovery phase. So on that, the landscape of technological innovation for new devices are changing as well. Meeting an unmet need or an underserved population is no longer sufficient to ensure that your technology is being adequately reimbursed by the payers. Innovators nowadays need to address the dual goals of not only improving health outcomes, they also need to reduce the costs, because improving health outcomes at a much higher cost might not be reimbursed by the payers because of our ballooning healthcare costs on every aspect. So how can you go about it? The approval and adoption process are based on a hierarchy of evidence. First of all, you need to show that the new technology is cost effective, that the economics are making sense for the payers. It definitely needs to provide an added clinical benefit. It is improving the health outcomes. Even if there are some risks, you need to show your new technology or innovation is improving the health outcomes by reducing the risk of substantial side effects. And then finally go for the regulatory approval, where you need to show that the technology that you are innovating is safe and effective at the same time. Now, once you're done with your discovery phase, comes the first valley of death. While you are in this space after discovery phase, you need to look at questions like, what is the decision-making process for potential stakeholders who are going to adopt my product? Who are the regulatory bodies? Who are the players? As I mentioned, in a hospital system, it will be probably the procurement offices, whereas for a private clinic setting, it will be probably insurance companies or payers who will be directly paying for your device. Who are the KOLs, like the key opinion leaders in this field, both from a clinical perspective as well as from a Plex perspective, people who are living with spinal cord injury? And then understand how to engage and communicate early and often with these stakeholders groups. Because the more you communicate with them, the more not only you will learn from them, but they will learn about your technology as well. And so when your technology will eventually be in the market, they already know and they will feel that they have been engaged as part of this development process. Now, the other thing that you need to look out for as you are going towards clinical research is that what is the evidence that I need to collect to satisfy the various stakeholders that you need to engage? What are the regulatory requirements? Which can be separate from what the payer needs to look at. Regulatory wise, you might get approval if it is a safe or effective treatment or a solution. But the payers will be looking at not only whether it is safe, but whether it is reducing the overall healthcare costs for them down the line. You need to also engage the Plex decision-making process. How do members of the community learn about new technologies? What are the data that they want to see in terms of trying out a new product or going for a new product? Who are the clinicians who would be using your technology, and what is the data that they need to see? Whether they might be interested in looking at whether it incorporates in their workflow, whether it saves them time in their workflow, whether it is helping them treat their clients in a better way. These are the things that you need to ask from the market, from the various stakeholders, to ensure that the product that you are developing is able to satisfy these requirements or these data requirements. So once you have identified the clinical trials that you need to be running and the clinical data that you need to be collecting based on your discovery research, you create your clinical trials and you gather the data towards the goal of getting regulatory approval. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that regulatory approval does not equal adoption. And that once you have gotten regulatory approval, it's just a way of getting approval that your technology or your innovation is safe and effective. That does not mean that it is adopted widely by the clinician community. Establishing a reputable reimbursement model takes a long time because payers need to see the value in supporting your technology. So as a CEO, your aim should be to have enough revenue, not just for clinical trials, but to pay your staff for your operations before a sustainable revenue is achieved. And one thing about payers is that you should target maybe 1 or 2 payers to test out your model before you look at broad acceptance. Because once you have the approval from 1 or 2 payers, then other payers take note and then they start following through. It is about identifying that early adopter, both in terms of both in terms of your clinicians and as well as your payers. In terms of the reimbursement that I talked about, there are multiple facets of getting your technology reimbursed by the payers. One thing that you need to look at is that the technology or the innovation, whether there is an existing code for it. A code is a way for categorizing medical technologies that is tied to a reimbursement amount. You need to look at if there is an existing code that might work better for you, because then you don't have to worry about reimbursement right from the get-go. And it's always advisable that even if there is an allied or an associated code that you can expense your claims against, it is always better to go for that instead of going for a completely new code at the very beginning. Because getting a new code can cost a lot, and it can also be in you will be in a situation where it will be marked as an experimental code where a lot of payers will not be approving for. So you need to find out whether your new technology fits within the coding landscape, if there is an existing code, or you can use your technology for as an additional or an add-on code that provides additional payment for an existing code. But one thing to keep in mind is that having a code does not automatically mean that your technology is going to be paid for. There are numerous codes that are out there that have zero payment associated with it. So you need to make sure that not only you have a code, but you have a reimbursement pathway for your innovation or technology as well. Now, in terms of adoption, understanding the true barriers to adoption is essential to driving growth. What it means is that you need to identify who your perfect beneficiaries are going to be. This is the group for whom your technology or your innovation will offer the greatest benefit. This would be your beachhead indication for the standard of care. Once you have established that perfect group of beneficiaries, then it is time for you to move towards subsequent indications. Whether you can add additional indications to your product to improve your revenue flow. Typically, these would have a decreasing benefit. Maybe it would be harder to identify, and also it will be slower to adopt, but these are critical for your long-term success of the technology adoption. And then finally, you need to also figure out what are the clinical and regulatory strategy that you need to be taking. What is going to be your launch strategy? What is your strategy in engaging key opinion leaders, both from a clinician perspective as well as an end user perspective? Now, one thing to keep in mind is that based on the geography of where you are planning on launching your product, the way that you approach healthcare systems could be widely different. In case of the Canadian public healthcare system, one thing that needs to be taken care of is that there's a disparate network of health authorities and hospital networks. Adoption by one health authority unfortunately, in Canada, does not automatically equate to adoption across the entire country because there's no unified approval or adoption process. One thing that can be said about this is that in general, in any medical new technology in the medical device space, there's generally a culture of risk aversion, both from the point of view of changing the standard of care, as well as from an administrative or procurement space where they do not want to spend money on technologies without established benefits. This is why it is very critical to establish internal champions, both from a clinician point of view as well as from an administrative point of view. You need to identify who is going to be your clinical champion within that health authority or that hospital network, because they are going to be your advocates for your technology to ensure that it is being incorporated in that hospital or that health authority. Once you have passed the clinical research part, then you need to look at how can you incorporate this technology as part of the standard of care in the clinical practice. One thing to keep in mind, as I alluded to earlier, was that it is very hard to change clinician behavior because they are set and on something, again, going back to the risk aversion. If they have a technology or a way that they know that it helps people and they're able to safely administer that to their clients, they do not want to change unless they see a huge improvement on the outcomes. That is why you need to answer the questions for them by helping them understand what is it that your technology would make it better for your end users. What will make them abandon what they're using right now to incorporate your technology or innovation. You need to identify how a physician's attitudes influence their motivations to change. As you can imagine, for any new technology, there would be early adopters and there would be the mass market adopters. You need to identify who are your early adopters that you need to look for. These are the people that want to see, they are primarily driven by the data, the clinical data. You need to talk to them to identify what is the clinical data they need to take an informed decision to try out your technology. And then identify whether this can be generalized across the continuum. If you have engaged with an individual, can you make generalizations? What are the categories or the types? How can you segment the market? These are the questions that you need to answer before you can go for a wide-scale adoption of your technology. So as I mentioned, it's a long and arduous path from the bench to nationwide adoption for the clinical, for your innovation. And there is no template for how to achieve that. But hopefully, through these best practice guidelines that we talked about in this module, you will be able to have a structure for how to approach that and make sure that you are sidestepping, so to speak, the values of death, and then making sure that you're shortening the time from bench to the nationwide adoption. Thank you.